Tonight, protesters flood the streets of New York yet again, defying Mayor Bill de Blasio's request to suspend demonstrations until 2 officers who were killed in the line of duty are laid to rest. This as the NYPD steps up patrols after receiving more threats. Will the unrest simmer anytime soon? Also, Congressman Michael Grimm ignores calls to resign after pleading guilty to federal tax evasion charges. Should Grimm throw in the towel? And North Korea's hack on Sony Entertainment crippled the launch of the film The Interview. But what should the U.S. government do? Step in and treat the corporate act of cyber terrorism like it would a real physical threat? Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman. Richard French has this Christmas Eve off. Thank you so much for joining us. We begin tonight briefly in Missouri, where another black teenager has died after being shot and killed by a white police officer. Authorities say the shooting happened last night at a gas station in Berkeley, Missouri. The city's mayor says the victim, 18-year-old Antonio Martin, was the aggressor in the case, not the officer.
This young man was shoplifting. When the officer came there, the video shows that the deceased pointed a gun.
And then almost immediately after the incident, anger erupted. A crowd of 200 to 300 people gathered at the station after the shooting. Fights broke out, bricks and 3 fireworks were thrown, 2 of them at the roughly 50 officers on scene. A convenience store was also vandalized. Several arrests were made. 2 police officers were injured. Berkeley is located near the city of Ferguson, where 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot by a white police officer. That incident and the grand jury's decision in the case sparked a series of violent protests. And that leads us back to New York City, where protesters are taking to the streets despite Mayor Bill de Blasio's request that demonstrations suspend themselves until NYPD officers Rafael Ramos and Wenjin Liu are laid to rest. The officers were shot and killed after being ambushed Saturday in Brooklyn by Ishmael Brinsley. Police say Brinsley, who had a long rap sheet, had been arrested nearly 20 times, traveled from Baltimore to New York with the intention of killing 2 police officers. This following those decisions in the Michael Brown and Eric Garner cases. The NYPD has increased security at station houses across the city and made at least 2 arrests after receiving threats against police officers. A lot to get into on both of these topics. We want to bring in tonight's panel. Richard St. Paul is here, Republican strategist, former vice chair for the National Black Republican Association. Mark Furnish, a professor of Brooklyn law and has argued before the U.S. Supreme Court, impressively as always. And Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. Let's start with the New York protests and focus there. And we've heard calls for the protests to be delayed until the 2 NYPD officers are laid to rest. Just around the table quickly, should they, and are the families and leaders of those protests doing enough to try to stop them, Mark?
It's a democratic process. I don't know how you can call a moratorium on protests, whether you agree with them or not. They're going to continue until the anger dissipates and moves on to something else. I mean, I live there. We see what's going on in the streets. You're asking for respect and silence just because a funeral is ongoing. We know from the Westboro case that doesn't happen. So.
Richard?
I totally agree. I think that, look, people don't want to lose the momentum of what's happening here, which is that there is an issue in the community with police officers and minorities, and that issue doesn't go away simply because there's a funeral. Yes, I think people are mournful and they're sad that it happened, but yet there is a democratic process at play also.
Dominic, we haven't heard from the Garner family. We haven't heard from Al Sharpton. Should they be getting involved to try to say, let's hold off on these protests, or is it just going to happen?
I think right now Reverend Sharpton is tending to his own damage control, so I don't really see a scenario where...
That's always the case with him. We have to prioritize, don't we?
But if I may just go back to your last question, I take a different approach than my colleagues. It's outrageous, it's despicable, it's horrible for these protests to go forward when Officer Liu, Officer Ramos, the funerals have not happened yet. This is not to say that you can't protest. Protest all you want. And I do want to point out that I believe that this is one of these fringe groups where they have an entirely different set of agenda. I really believe that most New Yorkers of goodwill are going to stay home and respect these officers and not protest until at least the funerals have been held.
Oh, listen, I don't condone what they're doing, but I condone their right to do it. I mean, let them go out and yell. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. It's not going to bring back the police officers, and it's not going to bring back.
I agree with you,
Garner either.
Counselor, but we've got to lower the temperature, Andrew. It's reaching the point, those police officers that are out there that have to sign to the protest, some of these people are saying things that are very disrespectful, and it can quickly escalate into a very, very bad situation.
I'm glad you talked about lowering the temperature, because there's an opportunity, and there certainly have been opportunities on all sides of this to lower the temperature, and it doesn't seem like those opportunities have been
anybody
taken.
wants to lower the temperature. And people have, I think Dom said it, there's an agenda that's driving it. I don't know what it is, and how do you see this culminating? How do you see this resolving? I can't understand.
Look, I think. Look, this has been an issue between white police officers killing black men for a number of years. I've been living in the city for 37 years, and I can tell you the 80s and 90s were much worse with New York City Police Department and the minority community. So it's an issue that has to be addressed, whether it's body cameras, whether it's African Americans serving on more juries or becoming police officers. Something it's got to come to a head. Something has to be done.
But there are also other issues at play. I agree with you, Counselor. I was out there covering it. You mentioned the 80s and so on. But there are also other, for example, Andrew, I don't understand. How do you protest in Missouri when, if the allegation is correct, the young man had a gun? What are you protesting? I mean, police are trained to shoot for the largest mass of body. And if the allegation is correct, and if this young man was shoplifting, and if this young man pulled a gun on a police officer, it just seems that the priorities are twisted from the community. I don't understand.
I don't understand it either, because I agree with what both of you just said. Things were much, much worse here in the 80s and 90s, and I guess the difference is the media coverage of it, the availability of social media, computers, everything is in everybody's face 24/7, and I don't know how a lid is going to be kept on any of this.
I want to get back to calming temperatures in New York, and at first I want to read something that Chris Smith wrote in New York Magazine when talking about Mayor de Blasio. And he said that Mayor de Blasio, in his Staten Island speech, missed an opportunity. He said if de Blasio had gone on to talk about how thousands of teenagers, black as well as white, were able to walk home safely at night thanks to the NYPD, he might have won the respect of cops who were looking for de Blasio to be a passionate mayor for the entire city. There's the quote there, and I think that's a fair point. A lot of criticism has been aimed at de Blasio for seeming to take the protester side, or seeming to slight the NYPD in all of this. And I think that would have been an opportunity to lower the temperature. Now I want to compare that to what we heard from Pat Lynch after de Blasio spoke about the Garner verdict. And we'll play that for one. Okay. All right. Well, Pat Lynch, as you know, has said,
we all know what he said.
Right. Some of the blood is on City Hall and is on and on Mayor de Blasio. How is anything that I understand? At least in my mind, de Blasio has been trying to lower the temperature. How has Lynch's comments done anything towards that end? How has Lynch done anything but inflame the situation even more?
No, I think he's absolutely inflamed the situation by basically saying Mayor de Blasio is the enemy, and the speaker, New York City speaker, is the enemy, and that they're anti-police officer. Those type of inflammatory remarks don't help. We need to heal and come together and figure a way how to do that, both as police, community, and the mayor's office. Matter of fact, actually recently, I just read earlier today that Pat Lynch gave a speech to about 1,000 police officers when they were receiving their guns and their shields, their equipment, and he said, the greatest thing you can do is form a relationship with members of your community. So, and Pat Lynch actually was a community officer. So I think he understands that. So it's his role privately as Pat Lynch, and then him as the PBA president. But I think as the PBA president, he's gone too far with some of his rhetoric.
I'm honestly waiting to hear calls for him to step down. I mean,
I'll call for it right now, because to me the guy had absolutely lost any shred of credibility he might have had when he came out and said police officers never get the benefit of the doubt, everybody else does. There's an exclusionary rule which is being eroded by the Supreme Court every day. That is basically a license for police misconduct. They are qualifiedly immune from suits when they make mistakes, and rightly so. So the law gives them every presumed benefit of the doubt, and the statement was just absurd when you aside from even turning his back, physically turning his back on the mayor. So in my view, none of these people are doing anything to help.
And if he's heating up the rhetoric, Pat Lynch, Dominic, then isn't he essentially making his officers less safe on the streets? I mean, if that's his whole argument, that de Blasio is making us less safe because he doesn't have our back, isn't he doing the same thing?
Okay, but let's be fair. He made these comments 4 days ago. He has not commented since then. He has issued emails and directives to officers about wearing their vest and so on and being safe. All I'm trying to say is we all know that he went too far with the comment, but you know, the union hasn't had a contract in a long time. They're basically at war with this mayor. You have to look at the history. This just didn't just happen the other day with this mayor. It goes back to the campaign for mayor.
But hasn't Lynch had more access to Gracie Mansion than he did under Giuliani, than he did under Bloomberg?
Look,
I mean, haven't the PBA have more of a voice, at least in this administration?
Regardless if he hasn't made the statements in the past 4 days, he's made the statements, he has to retract them, and they were certainly inflammatory, and I think they do raise the tension among the community and the police, which is unnecessarily so. I mean, when George Wallace stood on the steps and said, "Segregation now, segregation forever," you know, that stands in infamy. You know, so he never took those words back. So those words do mean something.
Two other points connected to everything that we've seen in New York. First of all, mental health. We talked about it a lot after Newtown. The shooter, the gunman who killed the two officers, apparently had something of a history, although it was undiagnosed or it wasn't treated. And he had an illegal gun. He had a gun that was last sold. The Times has a piece on this today about trying to trace the gun, and there's only so many steps that they can trace. Are those two topics getting enough attention? Are they getting any attention in the wake of all of these other?
There's no space for the attention because there's 3 or 4 stories that drive the news cycle every day, and there's not a shred of rationality on any side of this coming from the mayor or from the PBA. So we're not going to have a productive discussion about guns. That's a done deal right now.
I couldn't agree more, Counselor. And let's be honest about this, Andrew. We know that there are necessary dollars needed to go for mental health services. We know that there needs to be a crackdown on guns. But the Second Amendment, the NRA, that's taken off the table. It's not going to happen. And you're not politicians will talk a good game for the next couple of days about mental health services, just like they did with Sandy Hook, and then absolutely nothing will change.
I'm going to take a different spin on this. So part of the process right now is figuring out how an incident like this happened so it doesn't happen again. If you recall, in the paper, one, the gun was purchased in Georgia by an Asian man, and they can't trace how he got to this particular guy. Two, he had threatened on Instagram, and this is the shooter, the police officer threatened Ishmael, I think his name is, right? Threatened the police officer saying, "I'm going to put wings on pigs today," and that threat was received about a minute after the officer was shot from Baltimore PD. So New York City, one of the finest police departments in the world, is doing investigations trying to figure out how this happened and how to prevent that. So I think that's an important part. It's a smaller part of the story, but I think it's an important part of the overall story.
Last point on this subject. Joe Biden is headed to the funeral on Friday. President Obama remains on vacation. Should Obama be at the funeral instead of Biden? And has Obama done enough in the wake of the NYPD officers being killed, in addition to sounding off after Garner and after Ferguson? Richard?
Look, I think that I don't think it's necessary for the president to get involved in every particular issue. He certainly put himself out there with Ferguson, with Trayvon Martin. I think it's accumulation of things. One, because he's the first African American president, and two, because the nation is grieving over the divide of why black kids are being killed by white men.
But there are some people who look at the statements that he made after Ferguson or after Garner and say, well, he's conspicuous by his absence, talking about...
He's on vacation. I mean, I'm not a great fan of this president. Everybody knows that. He's entitled to go away on a vacation, not disrupt it for any funeral, wherever it may be, and to send the second highest executive in the land to go there. It's a non-issue. Really.
And frankly, Andrew, it would be a logistical nightmare.
That's true.
Well, that's
if
a
the
good point.
president, I mean, you're going to have 10,000 cops from all around the country out there, probably a lot more. And for the President of the United States with the Secret Service and all of that detail that comes along with it, logistical nightmare.
And should he speak at every police officer who is his killed funeral, right?
All fair points.
Yeah.
All fair
So-
points. All right, we're going to take our first break here on RFL. When we come back, the Dems are turning up the heat on embattled Congressman Michael Grimm. This after he pleaded guilty to federal tax evasion charges. Democrats want him to resign, but Grimm is resisting. Should he throw in the towel? Our panel weighs in on that and more next.